Pushkin. Maybe the most valuable thing that corporations create today is software. Just look at Google or Microsoft, two of the biggest companies in the history of the world, worth trillions of dollars, and they are built largely on lines of code that tell computers what to do. So maybe one of the most surprising things about the way technology works today is how much code people give away for free. In fact, most of the web runs on open source software. Software that's free for anyone to use, tweak, adapt, and share. The internet, maybe the most important engine of 21st century capitalism, is built on top of this hippie-ish, open source, free to be you and me dream. I'm Jacob Goldstein, and this is What's Your Problem? My guest today is Matt Mullenweg. In 2003, Matt co-created Wordpress, a piece of open source software people could use to publish blogs. Today, WordPress powers more than 40% of all the websites in the world, hundreds of millions of sites. Matt is also the founder of a for-profit company called Automattic. His problem is this: how do you build a multi-billion-dollar for-profit company on top of software that anyone can use for free? So, what's WordPress?
WordPress is an open source operating system for the web. So what's that mean? It means that if you wanted to have a home on the web, a place that you call your own,
What we used
with
to
your
call
own
a
domain,
website back in my
a website,
youth.
yeah, WordPress can power that. And because it's open source and created by the community, it's constantly getting better. So that when you choose WordPress, you're kind of hitching your wagon to a horse that is like on a really great path and that a lot of other people are contributing to. We do major new releases of WordPress 3 times a year, and typically 500 plus people work on every single release.
And how many of those people are getting paid to work on the release?
About 5%.
So almost none. So hundreds of people are doing it for free because they love it, because they believe in it.
Because it's useful to them. So developers don't like writing the same code twice. Right? So often what they'll do is once they've solved a problem, they'll create what we usually call a library, so that the next time another developer needs to multiply 2 numbers together or combine, take an image and turn it into grayscale, there's an existing function or library that does that. And you put it out there and you publish it. Today on the internet, you might publish that on a repository like GitHub, which is a place where a lot of people put open source code. But regardless of how you put it out there, if you're building something now, a lot of what developers do is Google. So they search. They say, okay, how to turn an image to grayscale in Python, which is the name of a language, or PHP, which is another programming language. And then you'll see tutorials and you see code examples and you see all these sorts of things. And so that becomes kind of the shared knowledge that we use to compose larger and larger things. And what's nice is that, maybe the first person who had to turn an image from color to grayscale, that took them like 5 days to figure out, right? Because you have to look at all the color codes and then figure out where that maps to on the gradient of 0 to 100 of white to black. But now I could just Google for 30 seconds, have a function and have that, and then I move on to my next problem. And so this is basically what all modern technology is built on, is people sharing what they've solved already and future people being able to build on top of it.
I love it. And, if you think of the standing on the shoulders of giants metaphor, it's like the shoulders get higher and higher really fast this way, right? Because everybody builds their little block and then puts it out there and everybody can grab the next block. I mean, a question I have is, if somebody is spending 5 days to learn how to do this one little thing, turn a color image into grayscale, and they're working for a for-profit company, why would that for-profit company give away the product of that 5 days of labor that they just paid for?
Well, maybe what that company is selling is advertising, and they don't really care about, turning images from color to grayscale. That's just something that was along the way.
Like a Google, like Google. Some coder at
Or
Google was
Instagram,
doing a thing.
right?
Yeah, or
You know,
Instagram. Yeah, yeah.
Instagram filter. So I think that what's the motivation for people doing open source? And it's fun. Again, one, if you're a coder, by the way, it is so cool to know that code you wrote is running billions of times a day all around the world. That is
Yeah.
like actually kind of like characters I typed on my keyboard are now being executed countless times all over the internet. That's kind of fun. So that, I don't know, maybe there's a thrill in that. I don't know what you
Yeah.
would call that, like
Yeah.
the joy of a craftsperson seeing their work used.
Yeah. So, okay, so that's an example of a thing that should be open source. Uh, is there any setting you can think of where it makes sense for an individual or a company, for whatever reason, to not make their software open source?
Well, companies might say that this is my secret sauce.
Reasonably so, right? Like that seems like a software company is in the business of selling software in some instances. Or
Yeah.
no? I mean,
Well,
I don't know. Is it reasonable to say it's their secret sauce, or do you think it's always a bad idea?
I hold no judgment for how people choose to license their code, whether they choose to make it proprietary or open. I have personally chosen to devote my life, like the past, 20 something years, and however long I'm still able to produce useful code, to creating open things, because I want to be part of upgrading humanity. I want to be a good ancestor. I want to make it so that the generations after can benefit from the code I've written, the things I've learned, the work I've done, and build on it in a way that takes us to ever greater heights versus having to reinvent the wheel over and over again.
So, okay, so that's the open source piece of it. You've also built a big company that is for profit, that is adjacent, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I was having so much fun doing open source. I had a question maybe similar to what you said earlier, which is like, how can I make a living doing this? Like, I love working with people and collaborating and making this shared resource for humanity. But I still have prosaic needs. I need to pay bills. So I started thinking what could be a business around this. So I founded a company called Automattic, and basically we make uh, add-ons for WordPress. So we could sell a plugin that enhances your WordPress, but that costs extra money. Um, we make it easy to run WordPress. So WordPress is code that you can run yourself, but we can run it for you and make it really easy. So we charge for that. And then we've expanded into other services, around sort of creating more freedom on the web and trying to allow people to express themselves. Something I personally get really jazzed about working on. And so we have apps for podcasting in Podcast. We have apps for journaling in Day One, for private encrypted journals, for publishing in Tumblr and WordPress. So we're kind of a little bit of a conglomerate now that makes lots of software that we hope we can fill up your home screen.
And more or less, how big is the business? How big is Automattic at this point?
Way bigger than I ever expected. Yeah, what started with me and a couple other folks just wanting to get paid to work on WordPress. We're now about 2,000 people. And because we had this open source background of collaborating online, we've actually been fully distributed from the very beginning. So those 2,000 people are actually in 97 countries.
You were remote forever for 15 years. And then the pandemic came along and the world, for very unfortunate reasons, sort of caught up with you.
Yeah.
So there's one piece of it, when I've heard you talk about it, that is particularly interesting to me. You tell me if I get it wrong, but it's this basic idea that when you really get to a high level of this remote or distributed work, people are mostly working asynchronously. So they don't have to be working at the same time. And you talk about this idea of moving from a sort of, synchronous conversation-based work culture to an asynchronous writing-based work culture. And that seems like a big, hard leap to me. Like, I write for a living. I wrote a book. I wrote for newspapers. Like, I know how to write. But the idea of having, a fundamentally writing based relationship with my colleagues rather than a fundamentally synchronous conversation based relationship with my colleagues seems super hard. Like that leap seems giant to me. So I'm curious how you've done it.
There's so much opportunity in the world just from taking something that people take for granted
Uh-huh.
and just take it off the shelf and use it exactly as it is, and really breaking it down and questioning the assumptions. I know we've done it this way for 100 years, but what are we really trying to accomplish? And is there a different way we could accomplish the same thing?
First principles, they call that?
Yeah, that's how we arrived at asynchronous work.
Uh-huh.
So, by the way, this is kind of how open source works. Because, right, when there's people all over the
Uh-huh.
world working on a shared code base, right, the code exists on the internet. Anyone can go see it and make a change to it or propose a change to it. And I don't need to be there while they're doing that. So
Yeah.
I think that so much of our, particularly how we did information work, kind of inherited a corporate mentality from factories when you kind of do need everyone in the same building working on the same car to like build the car. But when I would walk through offices and just see, rows and rows of people with headphones on looking at their computers, like, why do they need to be in the same room to do this?
Yes.
And what is the advantage of them being in the same room?
Well, there's a difference between the same room and the same time, right? Like, I think
Mhm.
I'm bought in on don't need to be in the same room, but I'm struggling to make the leap of not at the same time for a lot of complicated communication. I really like to talk to people.
I could tell you're the right job.
I suppose I'm not a good, right? Literally, my job is talking to people synchronously. So maybe I'm the wrong person to evaluate that. So let me ask you this in terms of, you've been doing this, you've been running a distributed company for what, 15 years now? More, right? For a long
17.
time. So, I think you must know things that would be useful for lots of people to learn right now. Lots of people are trying to figure out things that you've spent 17 years figuring out, right? So is there some, to be a little bit reductive or didactic, just things you've learned that you want to tell people who are just trying to figure out how to do distributed work that you learned the hard way?
I'll say two things. One is a subset of the other. So the first thing is there is so much benefit to invest in improving your writing.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Clarity of written communication is a superpower. It will multiply everything you do. And, written communication isn't everything.
Yeah.
Um, but if you can, read a book about writing or edit your own writing, ask someone else to edit it, whatever the process is that improves the quality of your written communication, will pay back manyfold.
Just to contextualize, I mean, presumably the idea is written communication becomes profoundly more important when you're working asynchronously, right? When you can't just have a conversation with your colleague, when you have to write them a message.
Yeah, the written word is really sticky. We obviously have
Yeah.
lots of options now,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's still something about the written word that can, you know, move society.
Yeah.
It can inspire, thousands, millions of people. It can, call people to the ocean. It can call people to war. It can call people, make them imagine a world beyond and live their
Yeah.
life in a totally different way. Just words on a page.
And yet I find the hardest written communications for me in a work context, the place where I most want to have a synchronous conversation is where there are emotional issues at play. When somebody's mad at somebody else and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, like that's
Hmm.
when I really want a synchronous conversation because the tone and the subtext is what I find hardest to get in written communication. The sort of emotional subtext and like power dynamics. Those are the things that I find really hard in writing at work.
Totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good time to talk to someone.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna
Yeah.
argue against that.
Okay. Good.
And it could be very valuable to um, I one thing that's common for us is if we find we're typing to each other a lot, and you know just getting more and more worked up, it's a good
Yeah.
time to pick up the phone.
Yeah.
But writing is just a subset of communication, and fundamentally, all human problems are usually a function of communication,
Yeah.
right? The myth of separation, this idea that we're not all connected, and failures of communication are, I think, the source of all human suffering.
After the break, how Automattic competes against giant for-profit companies that also build on WordPress. And Matt's plans for Tumblr, the old social media platform that Automattic bought back in 2019. That's the end of the ads. Now we're going back to the show. So I'm curious, I find it interesting in general to talk to people about things they haven't figured out yet, things they're working on now but don't quite know, haven't solved. So
I'll say our big problem.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about open source and the fun of contributing. Now, and you said companies might not want to do that because they want to keep their secret sauce or something. There's another problem that happens. So open source can fail when it's successful through something called the free rider problem.
Uh-huh.
So imagine if people got a lot of benefit from this open source code, but they didn't improve it.
Uh-huh.
They didn't give back their improvements. And then the people who were working on improving it, didn't get any of the benefit or money from it. And so they eventually just gave up and worked on other things. And then the sort of core would die. So I would say the big problem of open source is how to close the loop of people using it and contributing to it.
Uh-huh.
So in WordPress, for example, you can get WordPress from my company, Automattic, at wordpress.com. You could also get it from GoDaddy or from Bluehost or from Amazon or Google or a lot of other places. And these companies will take your money, but they won't put any of that back into developing WordPress.
And just to be clear, GoDaddy is using WordPress. They're taking the WordPress software that is created by everyone in the world all the time, and they're using it because it's open source and they can, but they're not sort of part of this open source community. They're just taking the software and selling it to me.
Which is totally fine. 100% allowed by the license, by the community, by everything. And
they're not breaking the rules, but so why is it a problem? What's the problem?
I guess another way to frame the problem would be that the companies who are only motivated by profit could outcompete the companies that also contribute back
could
some portion
outcompete
of the resources.
Right? Like at some point they could outcompete Automattic. And so you've built this thing and you are dedicating your life to the open web and open source, but they might, I don't know, execute better, be better capitalized, and put you out of business and sort of shut down the openness.
So one example is like by taking some of those profits and investing in advertising. So now all of a sudden they're buying Super Bowl commercials or buying ads on Google so that when you search for WordPress, the first 4 or 5 results aren't like actually the community. They're someone paying to be at the top. And so kind of the capital begets capital.
That is happening, right? Like GoDaddy had a Super Bowl ad.
Yeah.
So what do you do about that?
Well, I thought I could go on podcast and tell people about it, and that might help.
Here we are. It's not a Super Bowl ad, but it's what I got.
Well, I think that people really care. So if they knew about the philosophy and the community and kind of what we're trying to create over the long term, and that we're trying to build software that's going to be around in 100 years, people would be excited to be a part of that. And luckily, money can't buy love, right? So there's forces in the universe and even in capitalism far, far stronger than dollars.
Yeah.
And so essentially what we're betting on is that those forces win in the long term. But we also have to do a good job at telling our story, at being out there, at sort of making it easy for people to contribute and get involved. If we don't do a good job there, WordPress will fail and it will die, and it will just be, one of the thousands of open source projects that have withered on the vine and died. But if we get this right, it could be something that, 1,000 years from now, they're running WordPress on Mars or in other galaxies.
That is a good big. That's a good big frame. WordPress in another galaxy, like not even another solar system. Just go all the way. Let's talk briefly about Tumblr. How's Tumblr going? You bought it. I downloaded it for this conversation. I don't quite get it. Like, can you help me get it? Help me love Tumblr.
Tumblr is a blogging system. It's a social network. It was one of the original ones. It was quite good. After it got bought for $1 billion by Yahoo in like 2012, it was kind of mismanaged and withered a bit on the vine. We bought it to revive it. And part of why we bought it was it turned out the kids are still there. So Tumblr's primary demographic is 13 to 24. So I think always youth has wanted a place where their parents weren't, someplace that was maybe a little even harder to figure out, kind of like Snap was in the early days. So
I'm not supposed to get it. The fact that I don't get it is a feature, not a bug. I buy that.
Well, I would say that the fact that you don't get it right now is probably why kids love it.
Yeah, I buy that.
or younger folks really like having their own space.
Yeah.
So essentially, by anchoring Tumblr on art and artist, which was always kind of the core of it, like people sharing their creativity, we're creating like a third space, like a place that's not like you need to be professional like LinkedIn or be fancy like Instagram, but someplace you could just go like be weird, be creative, be yourself. And it turns out the internet wants that and needs it. Now, our challenge is running a social network is both technically and logistically very difficult to make the algorithms that show people what they want but don't inflame things, to garden and curate the community so that it has positive interactions but not like hate speech or violence or anything like that. Is you'll never hear me criticize Facebook for that, because it is a really, really hard problem to do at scale.
Tell me about I assume based on what you said before, that Tumblr is open source. I mean, it's sort of fitting into your broader galactic worldview. And what does that mean, right? So what does it mean to have an open source social network? And in what important ways is it different from other big social networks along that dimension?
So Tumblr was and is proprietary software when we bought it. But what we're doing is we're actually switching it to WordPress. So one of the projects, and it's going to take years because it's big. There's over 500,000 blogs on Tumblr that we got to migrate over. So it's just a lot of data, a lot of things to port. But we're actually switching those all to be powered by WordPress underneath. And so those will all be part of the open web as we do it.
So like in terms of whatever algorithms there are that, shows you content or serves you ads, like, are those open? Or will
it will be? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So that's what we're creating. We're literally building that right now. So you'll be able to see why am I getting served these certain things? You'll be able to see exactly the code that's choosing which posts that are served at the top for you. And you'll be able to choose other algorithms if you want. Maybe create your own and put it up there.
That feels big and exciting to me. Is it? And if so, why?
We'll see. I mean, honestly, this hasn't been done before. It's kind of new in society. But fundamentally, I want people to have freedom and autonomy. And right now, you get whatever algorithm TikTok, Facebook, Instagram decide to serve you. And that aligns with your interest to an extent. It also aligns with their interest to an extent. Like, what will happen if we allow people to have complete autonomy and choice there? Maybe it fails because people say they just want to, see NPR or New Yorker articles. But, when TikTok serves them, the the more like carbohydrates of information or entertainment, that's what they actually choose.
Yeah.
So they say they want to eat healthy, but they really choose something else. But
That
I don't
seems
know.
plausible. When you put it that way, it seems plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, naturally, I could put, 1,000 candies in front of you, and at some point you'd stop eating them.
In a minute, the lightning round, including a couple things Matt thinks should not be open sourced, and his favorite feature on a very high-end toilet. Now let's get back to the show. Let's do the lightning round. Given that you've been sort of, building the web in a pretty significant way for 20 years or so, what do you think you understand about the web that most people don't?
Something I understand about the web that most people don't is that we don't have to accept things the way things are. It is eminently possible to change it and modify it, especially on the web, and it can be so incredibly freeing.
What's your favorite feature on a Toto NeoRest toilet?
Definitely the heated seats.
Nice. What's something in the world that should not be open sourced? Doesn't have to be software, just anything.
To me, open source, you want to see more of. So if there were technology for harming people, I wouldn't want that shared or open source. Weapons, viruses, etc.
Is it right? Do you play jazz saxophone? Is that right?
You? Or I did.
Who do you think is a particularly underrated jazz musician?
Particularly underrated jazz musician. Ooh. Give me a moment. Jacob Collier. He's actually seen as a little bit of a pop musician. He came up on YouTube and everything, but I think he's one of the most talented instrumentalists alive today.
Wow. Interesting. Good. I've also read that you can type really fast using is it the Dvorak keyboard, like the other keyboard that's like better, basically? And I'm curious, are there other sort of optimizations, life hacks like that you've done? Are there other things where you've just done the better way thing that most people don't do?
Yeah, typing is definitely a different typing layout is something I'm glad I invested in many years ago. The other thing is in technology, it really does benefit you to update as frequently as possible. And so I'm always surprised when I see people with an older phone or computer or who have a ton of app updates they haven't applied. Especially when you think of how many times you look at your phone and how much time you spend on these tools, assuming you do, I think it is worthwhile to always invest in the latest and greatest.
Good. Okay, two more. What's one piece of advice you'd give to somebody trying to solve a hard problem?
Unplug. So just force yourself to be bored and sit with it. Meditate, take a walk, but remove yourself from distractions.
If everything goes well, what problem will you be trying to solve in 5 years?
I think how to manage and scale a 10,000 person plus organization.
How big is it now?
2,000.
So that's a lot of growth. Getting from 2 to 10, it's a big leap already.
Yeah.
Matt Mullenweg is the co-creator of WordPress and the founder of Automattic. Today's show was produced by Edith Russello, edited by Robert Smith, and engineered by Amanda K. Wong. I'm Jacob Goldstein, and I would love to know what you think of the show, what you want us to do differently, what guests you think we should book. Please email us at problem@pushkin.fm. Once again, that's problem@pushkin.fm. Or you can find me on Twitter @Jacob Goldstein. We'll be back next week with another episode of What's Your Problem?